everyone for coming. It's always a challenge to get people in on Sunday mornings, especially when your competition is both Tina Brown and also, I guess, people just queuing up at ATMs for some money on Sunday. We have a really fascinating panel today. I mean, Prue Leith is somebody I've read about like for ages. You know, my mother used to get this magazine called Woman and Home, and I remember that, you know, you featured in there so often. B. Wilson is someone who's works on history that I've really found fascinating. She's done a really amazing history of cooking told through utensils and the means of cooking, which is actually available over here. So, you know, I really suggest people go out and grab whatever copies that they have. And she's done a fascinating new book called First Bite, which unfortunately is not available, but is available on Kindle. You know, thank God for Kindle, which is a fascinating account of how people learn how to eat, how we form the habits that shape what we like and what we eat, which is actually going to be a large part of today's discussion about traditional food. And last, I'm really happy that we got Gil Hovav over here, because he comes from Israel, which is, in terms of tradition, a truly fascinating country, a country where traditions all get mixed up together and new traditions somehow get formed out of all of them, and I hope he's going to talk to us about it. Tomorrow, Gil will be doing a special session at Food Hall at Palladium, where he will be cooking and showing some of the real recipes from Jerusalem. So if any of you are interested, what time do you do? Okay, if any of you are interested, ask him what time after the event. Today's topic is about tradition, the meanings of tradition and food, and this is actually a very complicated issue and a very contentious in some cases. And partly it's because people are not always clear about what they mean. And Prue, I'm going to start with you because you've had you've been doing catering for really long. And one thing you learn when you do catering is that when people come to you with a brief, what they say and what they want isn't often the real thing. And a large part of what a caterer's job is to find out what people really want. So if somebody came to you and said that, we want a really traditional-like menu, what would you try and find out? What does that mean?
Well, the first thing I learned as a caterer is if you go to somebody's house and you're going to do their daughter's wedding or some big thing, is have a look at the house, have a look at them. Because you might think what they should be having is, say, let's a traditional English, smoked salmon followed by roast beef, followed by strawberries and cream. And actually, what they want is something completely different. And if their house is full of ornaments and very elaborate, what they want is elaborate.
Right.
And underneath it may be beef and salmon, but it's got to be really decorated and fantastic. So I think, the big trouble with catering, actually it's both the challenge and the interest of catering, but it's also the difficulty, is that you are trying to interpret somebody else's dream. Right. If you have a restaurant, it's your dream. And everybody, you hope that enough people will come, share your dream, and make you money. With catering, it's their dream, and it's much more difficult.
Right. So you need to figure out what their dream is, what their food.
What their taste is, what restaurants they eat at, what they admire, what cookbooks they read.
Right.
You can tell a lot from somebody's shelf in the kitchen.
Yeah. And how did you learn this? I mean, when you were starting catering,
I learned it the hard way.
Really?
Yeah. Well, I remember one of the first things I ever did was somebody asked me to do a picnic for Glyndebourne. Glyndebourne is an enormous country opera house, and the great thing is you take a very beautiful picnic and you have it in the interval. And they asked me to do this picnic, so I thought, well, how nice, I thought a picnic was something you ate in your fingers, so I made very nice avocado and salmon sandwiches and, little pots of creme brulee, little tiny pots you could eat easily like an ice cream. And that wasn't what they had in mind at all. They thought I was going to lay out an enormous buffet, very decorated, and so they could show off to their friends, and I got it dead wrong, and they wouldn't pay me.
They
so
wouldn't
I
pay
learned.
you. Okay, yeah. So that's where catering gets really tough. I mean, that's where if you don't get the dream, you don't get paid.
If you don't get paid, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. B, I want to throw this question about tradition to you because this is something that comes up a lot in your latest book, in First Bite, because one thing you say very clearly in the book is that so much of our tastes are driven by nostalgia and by what we remember. And this confuses matters a lot because the way we remember a dish may not actually be the way that a dish is, normally prepared by acceptance. Could you tell us a little bit about this huge role that as you say, scientists have found that nostalgia plays in taste?
So, I mean, almost everything that we think of as taste is actually memory. I hadn't realized, when we talk about food and nostalgia, people will wax lyrical about Proust and the Madeleine. Babies have nostalgia. Nostalgia is actually a really basic thing that every human being has.
How do babies have nostalgia?
Babies have nostalgia because they are imprinted with memories of flavors from their mother's diet. And this has been proved by a series of remarkable experiments. There are a couple of scientists in the States called Julie Manella and Gary Beauchamp. And one of their experiments, they gave pregnant women lots and lots of carrot juice to drink in the last trimester of pregnancy. And they found that when those babies were given their first bites of solid food, they actively preferred the flavor of carrots. So if you imagine that process happening lots and lots of times for each of us before we're even born, we're born kind of embedded and imprinted with these memories. We don't realize they're memories, though. So we think that our likes and dislikes are something deep and meaningful about ourselves, and we feel we can't ever escape them. But in fact, we can. We're malleable still. It's possible to develop new memories, new positive associations. The real danger now is that so many people are imprinted with memories not of traditional food, but of junk foods. And if you're given these things with love, often enough, by someone that you respect, then you yearn for them all of your adult life. You're trying to return to this lost space of childhood. So giving up these foods, it's partly giving up part of yourself, and that's very difficult to do.
That's really fascinating because, in India, there have been these sort of traditions of, when women are pregnant, especially towards the last trimester, they are, fed special foods. And it's supposed to be for the health, but I guess it's also, it has this other effect of carrying on traditions. Does this make sense to you, what she's saying, that traditions can be implanted from birth? Gil, do you have?
I think what I got from my mom is my love for gin.
Okay.
She must have drank a lot. She must have drank immensely when she was pregnant because I can't do without it. But the thing you said about nostalgia, I know it from my writing. I wrote 3 food wars, 3 memoirs that were dealing with food. And it's all about my grandmother's cooking, whom we were living with at the time. But I remember and in each story, at the end of the story, I gave the recipe of what we ate when the story occurred. But I remember trying to remake a very, very, very simple tomato soup that she used to make for us. It was called butterfly soup because the rice that's in the tomato soup opens to the shape of butterflies. And I was trying to make it and trying to make it and trying to make it, and it was good, but it wasn't it. And one night, I had a dream about her. In the dream, she was cooking the soup for me, and I saw that by the end of the recipe, she would grate 2 carrots into the soup to add sweetness. Got up in the morning, made the soup, put the carrots inside, tasted it, immediately tears into the soup. Immediately, I started crying. It was just so real. So yes, food and memory do work together.
Prue, have you had this sort of experience?
Well, no, I'm so interested in that whole area that Bee is talking about imprinted memory from before you're born. And also the first 6 months of your life, how important it is what you get to eat. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity because if we only understood this more, we would make sure that we were imprinting the right memories into our children and we would feed them correctly.
Right.
And I'm all for, I will keep telling the government in England this, but they take no notice. We should take away some of the money that goes into adult education and shove it into pregnant women's education and toddlers, up to toddlers, really that's the time that your brain is most active and where you're getting the right likes and dislikes for the future. So that's where we should spend the money, on tiny babies and fetuses.
Right. I mean, you've been involved in a lot of policy issues because you've served on so many, committees and things like that. I mean, do you think it's possible that, that be this sort of, a shift in emphasis and funding for pregnant women?
Well, I think they're beginning to think about toddlers and little ones. But what is interesting is that all the time that I was working with government, the money we had for changing the nutrition of children at school was all for primary school and secondary school, and nothing for under 5-year-olds. But actually, it would have been far better to have done it for babies.
And some of the food served in British nurseries is terrible. I mean, in my book, I write about in Finland, but it isn't just Finland, it's actually throughout Scandinavia, but Finland is the country who's embraced it the most. Around 10 years ago, they noticed that they had worse rates of child obesity compared to Sweden or Norway, their other neighbors. And they decided to do something about it, and they changed their whole system of preschool education to something called sapere. And the idea is you teach children about food not by saying, eat this because it's healthy. That never works. We know that people hate being told what to put in their mouths. It doesn't work. In Britain, we have had, do you have 5 a day in India? Maybe you don't need 5 a day. I mean, it seems like the whole of Indian cuisine is founded on a love of vegetables. British cuisine is definitely not founded on a love of vegetables. And the more we are told, eat these vegetables, the less people want to swallow them. It makes them like a bitter pill. But this Finnish system of education, it takes preschool children. They're lucky because their preschool phase goes on a bit longer than ours does. But it's learning through the senses. They might taste 5 different kinds of berries and just talk about what they like. Because nothing any adult ever tells a child about food is as powerful as putting something in your mouth. That's how you learn about food.
I mean, all of you have children. You've had this experience of feeding your children and forming their tastes and nurturing their, nurturing the way they see. Has that worked? I mean, what you remember putting in the first six months of your child's life, has that worked into what they like, as adults in terms of the likings for food?
To be honest, I'm so old that when I had my children, which was 42 years ago, we didn't know anything about how the brain worked and all this stuff. So I just tried to feed them healthily, and I have one adopted Cambodian daughter and one homemade son. They're both the same age. And my daughter took to healthy food like a duck to water. I began to believe in folk memory because she loved spices from the time she could eat.
Really?
And she wasn't brought up in Cambodia. She was with me from 6 months on. So she was only on a bottle while she was in Cambodia. But she has always loved spicy food and every food, and she would taste anything. My son, on the other hand, grew up, as so many English boys do, he never ate any vegetables. And I didn't worry about it because he ate a lot of fruit, so I thought that's fine, he's getting his vitamins. And then when he was 19, he said, I was telling him about some research about how if you repeatedly give children the same vegetables, for example, if you give 9 2-ounce portions of broccoli, the child will like the broccoli after 9 doses, and 5 for peas, and 4 doses for carrots or something. And so I was telling him this, and he said, do you think it'll work for me? And I said, for goodness sake, you're 19, why change the habit of a lifetime? I've given up on you. And he said, no, it's really important, because when I go out to friends' houses and I'm hiding the vegetables in my turnips or in my pockets, and I'm trying to pretend I'm eating something which I hate. And so I said, well, just try. So I said, why don't you just accept every vegetable you're given for the next 6 months? Never say no. And he did
This
it.
was when he was 19?
And he was 19.
Okay.
And he did it, and he just said, okay, I'm going to eat everything. And now he eats everything, including beetroot and spinach and all the things he hated. You just have to make an effort. It's habit that does it. But it is tedious. It's very difficult to make children want to eat something 5 times. isn't
Yeah,
it?
and it's difficult to make adults do. I mean, what you're describing with your son, it's lucky he was motivated, and it's lucky he had you that he could confide in, because I came across, there are lots and lots of adults living with the limited palate of a toddler who will refuse invitations to eat with friends and who will just manage their predicament because you don't want to put something in your mouth when it disgusts you. So it's a kind of catch-22.
And I think that God punishes us through our children. So my daughter loves sushi. I detest sushi. And she always orders sushi from a restaurant. She says, Gili, don't cook. We'll order a takeout of sushi. And everybody asks her, since in Israel, you know, I have food shows, etc. So they say, wow, you must be eating great food, etc. She says, dreadful cook. And I'm gay, and I have her with a lesbian mother who's a raging dyke. She plays basketball for the national team, you know. So everybody assumes, including me, that I'm the chef. One day my daughter tells me, you should learn from mom how to cook, how to make chicken soup. I say, what? From her? From the raging dyke? Then I call her mom and I say, well, you know, you have to teach me how to make chicken soup. And she starts laughing and I say, it's not polite to laugh at me. And she says, no, she told me I should learn from you how to make chicken soup. So children are just problematic, that's all.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know, one thing one gets, which is, especially from your book, which is a bit sad, is the sort of fear of food that is inculcated in us from such an early age. And when you, as in your son's example, you know, it is possible for people to change. How do we get over these sort of fears of food? And I'm not talking about, you know, religious objections to food, because that's a different area and that's understandable. But I'm just talking about fear of unfamiliar foods.
I mean, it's really difficult. I don't think there's ever been such a complicated time in which to feed children, because there are all of these kind of generalized anxieties that we as parents pick up on, of feeling there are right foods and wrong foods, and this awful term which we have in Britain, clean eating, which suggests that maybe there is something which might be dirty eating. And so a parent feeding a child, there's this kind of sense already before they've taken the first mouthful that you're so desperate for them to have a vegetable that, of course, that's the last thing the child wants to do. But there are these new techniques which have been pioneered. I mean, when you say, how does someone get over their sadness or anxiety about food, it completely depends where you start from. I mean, human beings are very diverse people. As Prue has said, you had 2 children, you fed them the same, they ended up completely different. And there are so many ways in which a human being can make themselves unhappy with food. There are bulimics, there are anorexics, there are compulsive eaters, there are people that eat nothing but grilled cheese sandwiches. But if you're in the predicament of being terrified, let's say, of green vegetables, whether you're an adult or a child, there's this new technique which sounds ridiculously simple, but it's an elaboration of what Prue has described. So we know that the main way anyone learns to love something is through exposure, familiarity, nostalgia, as we've said. We love what tastes of home. We love what tastes of mother's milk to us. But how do you make something taste like home when you're looking at the broccoli and it looks like slugs and you don't want to put it anywhere near you? You know, the more you expose yourself in a situation of nausea, it just reinforces the disgust. But what these feeding clinics have found is if you make the food being tasted as small as a pea or even a grain of rice, it's possible for the person to put it in their mouth, and you can then enact this repeated system. And it really works. I interviewed an amazing man who runs a feeding clinic in Pennsylvania. He's called Keith Williams, and he works with some kids. A lot of them are on the autistic spectrum. And he was working with a teenager with Asperger's syndrome who had been fed by tube just to get enough calories to survive for the best part of a decade. It was heartbreaking. All this boy would eat was pasta, but it couldn't be any pasta. It had to be in the shape of a bow tie, farfalle pasta, ham steak, and then I think, what was his third food? I forget, Oreo cookies, maybe. And over the course of a fortnight, he used this tiny tastes technique to get him to like more than 50 new foods. It's life-changing because you're then back in the company of the table. It's not just food that you're missing when you're eating in this unhappy, neurotic way. It's all of the social life of being in a kitchen surrounded by other people, all of that, what it means to share food around a table.
I'm going to look for micro sushi after this session. Maybe it will work for me. But I want to talk about a much older technique that worked for my mom. As I said, we were growing up with my parents and my grandmother, and we never drank milk. We hated milk, my brother and I, and my grandmother would kill my mother. The children don't drink milk, they would die, they would not have bones. We were paid for drinking milk. Every glass of milk that we had, we got 25 cents. A film was 50 cents. So up until today, I really dislike milk, but I'm a rich person. So
Sometimes bribery does work.
Yeah, bribery works.
Sometimes it doesn't.
in Israel, it does.
If you bribe, what you should never do is say, eat the broccoli and you get the chocolate cake. If you bribe with something other than food, it can work. Stickers also work if you don't want to bribe. Yeah, cash.
Yeah.
Do you know, when I was working on the school food trust, trying to get mothers particularly to make really healthy lunch boxes, or even better, let their children eat at school, because we have very strict rules about what could be fed to children at school. And I met one mother and she said, do you know, I'm so pleased with my little boy because he has school lunches every day, and I always give him a Kit Kat bar as a reward for eating his school lunch. And I think, you've just undone it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you said, this is actually a fascinating time because I don't think at any other point in time, I mean, people have had access to so many different kinds of food. I mean, obviously, in the West, you have, food from every part of the world, but even here in India, I mean, we're now getting, because of refrigerated containers, I mean, you can get food from any part and at a cost, obviously. And I think, what it shows us that people's tastes can change. With apologies to Gil, I mean, who hates sushi. I mean, to me, the most amazing thing is the acceptance of sushi. I mean, when you started your career, if you had said, "Are we going to serve raw fish and rice?" What would your diners have said?
Well, when I started my career, we'd hardly heard of sushi, but we'd hardly, unless you lived in London, we hadn't heard of avocado, pears, or broccoli. I mean, food in England in the 60s was pretty terrible. But I think that the great thing that India has, and you see it on the street food and you see it in all the time, is that people are still cooking at home and they're eating traditional food. And God, please hang on to that, because once you've lost it, once you're addicted to McDonald's and, ice cream on a stick, you probably won't go back, because your children will identify with this idea of the new fashionable Western junk as something cool. And, when you see people having a vegetarian diet that is based on rice or dal, I tell you what, I feel better for 4 days in this country than I ever feel in England. The food just makes, I was saying, last night I regret to say I had far too much to drink, but I woke up having been to a party, been to bed very late, but because I've been eating Indian food, I felt great this morning.
And this is like real Indian food, not like British Indian food.
Yes, I mean, obviously we've been treated round here with a bit of strange Indian food like pizza suddenly appeared, but it was a damn sight better pizza than you ever get in England. It was very thin and, just healthy and delicious.
Right.
The thing I find extraordinary, I was talking to Vikram about this yesterday, you were telling me more about it, is that you have, India is not the only example, but India, you really do have the most amazing food. I have dreamed of Indian food most of my life, and now to be here and to be tasting the reality is incredible. Having eaten lots of kind of faux Indian food in Britain growing up, it's wonderful. But to have this cuisine, which is so varied and so healthy and so based on vegetables and pulses, and then to have this influx of foods like white sliced bread, Subway, Starbucks, you wouldn't stand a chance in India, and yet they're somehow still making inroads. And there is this kind of uneasy tension between traditional food and modern convenience food, and it's happening all over the world. It's happening in the Middle East. If you look at obesity, the highest levels of obesity in the world are now among boys in Kuwait. And it's partly, friends I have who come from the Middle East say, well, Kuwaiti food was always very fatty compared to the food of Lebanon, which was more vegetable-based. But still, traditional Kuwaiti food, it was based on spices, it was home cooked, it was made from scratch, there was some kind of portion control. And now, suddenly, there's Kentucky Fried Chicken, and you'd think people would have an innate preference for the traditional. And it seems that's not the case. It seems that somehow convenience wins out.
I mean, the large manufacturers, large food manufacturers have a lot of power in terms of marketing and also, in terms of structuring the food. I mean, you have this wonderful story about making sausages, making the traditional sausages for a large manufacturer. But in what seems to happen most often is that the food is so tweaked and so sweetened and so that people just fall for it. How do you balance it out? How do you...
I think it's a really difficult problem because certainly in England, manufacturers have so much power because so much of their profits go into tax and the government doesn't want to say boo to them. But the fact is they pile especially their cheaper end of the food range with sugar, fat and salt. Those are the three cheapest ingredients they can get their hands on. And if they put enough of them into the food, guess what? We love it because we are addicted to sugar. We've been created to search out sweet foods, sweet berries, sweet fruits, because sugar gives you energy. But we were never made to have manufactured sugar in corn syrup in everything and sugar in everything. And we get sugar now in everything. And I think that as you say, the marketing budget for one single thing like a Mars bar will be more per day in money terms than the School Food Trust or any government quango or any charity has in a year to spend on trying to persuade people to eat the right food. And I think the manufacturers are going to win, frankly. I feel very depressed about it because I don't know how you stop people making money from selling junk.
I mean,
Sorry, but I think what was interesting about your story about making the sausages is that when you put your foot down and said, no, I have to have a sausage made as I want it, with mostly no bread, no fillers, no additives, they could do it. And this is the thing about manufacturers, they have power.
They can do it, but this example you're giving was when I was a board member of a big supermarket in the UK, and I wanted them to make a decent sausage, and we were selling rubbish sausages. And they kept saying, nobody will buy a proper sausage because if you put nothing but good ingredients into it, it's going to cost too much, and people think sausages are cheap food, and so they won't buy it because it'll cost too much. But because I was on the board of the company, and I had the air of the chairman, which meant I had power, I finally got them to make a decent sausage. And guess what? It won Sausage of the Year award. And it flew out of the shops, and it was a huge success. But I could never have done that if I hadn't been on the board of the company and bullied my fellow board members into backing me.
So you need to be on many more boards.
You need power to do these things, and most of us don't have it.
Right. Gil, what do you think? Do you think manufacturers can actually produce, good, real, wholesome food, large food manufacturers?
Yeah, sure. If they put their heart in it and their budget in it, no problem at all. It's very easy to make. Food is very simple. It's not that there are no big secrets. I'm sure that and sometimes nowadays they can. I guess that this was a pioneering deed, but nowadays you can find good supermarket food.
Yeah, it's true. It's true, and that is. Because there is a demand for it. I mean, it's a circle, isn't it? Somebody has to produce it to get the demand, and then once you've got the demand, other people will produce it. So at the moment, it's very fashionable in the UK to have healthy food, but it's only, what is sad is because it's more expensive, it's confined to the people who are rich enough to buy it. And I think the great tragedy, certainly in our country, is that the rich get richer and eat better, and it becomes a hobby, and it's very fashionable to like good food, and so it's fine. But the poor are getting poorer, relatively, and they are unable to access fresh food. if you live on a housing estate, there won't be a bus service to the to a supermarket. There won't be a local supermarket. There will be a little shop on the corner selling tinned junk, and that's it. And then we complain that people don't eat properly. Well, of course they don't. They can't.
That's the concept of food deserts that they call it.
Yes.
You know, areas where you just don't have access to like to like healthy food. But you know, I'm emphasizing this point about asking whether large manufacturers can be part of the solution, because let's face it, there was a downside to traditional food, and the downside to traditional food was the immense amount of work, often by women, often by servants or low-paid people, who went into doing it. So for instance, people say like, why can't we just have chapatis all the time? But making chapatis is backbreaking work, which the women in the family did, and it seems to me that it's a bit. We need to find a balance, between the sort of traditional work which depended on this sort of unpaid labor of so many people, and some sort of manufactured solution.
I think, sometimes, I write about this in my book, Consider the Fork. I have a chapter called Grind, which begins with, I was just shocked, looking through historic recipes. I came across one from the 14th century for pancakes, and it begins by saying you take a copper pan, you take some eggs, you take some white wine, which they're using instead of, in Britain I would use milk, take some flour. So far, it's kind of like my pancake recipe. And then it says, beat the batter long enough to weary one person or two. And it just conjures up this image of a kitchen where you have these people lined up, these human robots. And as Vikram says, actually, in many kitchens, that's still the reality. It's just these people are wives. And they're capable of great artistry, great craftsmanship, but so much of it goes unacknowledged, unsung. And it's often taken a terrible toll on women's bodies. When archaeologists dug up bones from the Middle East from 20,000 years ago, around the time that grindstones, the equivalent of our modern pestle and mortar, were first invented, they found that these women's knees, hips, practically just worn down by arthritis, even if these skeletons were from young women. So I think Vikram is completely right. There is a trade-off. We need to have a reverence for food traditions, because this food there is a great hidden ingenuity in the kitchen, much of which has just been built up over centuries. I don't think there's any tool that's ever been invented that's greater than the wooden spoon. You can take your sous vide machines and your packaget and your foam, just a wooden spoon and a cooking pot. That's a wonderful thing. But there is a trade-off, and we somehow need to invent, both with feeding and cooking, new models that reach some kind of accommodation between the new demands of living in this world of abundance, which those of us who are lucky enough to have too much to eat rather than not enough. We're lucky, but it requires new ways of thinking about food.
I think that the compromise is very easy. I look at Israelis and the way they cook. Maybe it depends on the weather, but in Israel it's very simple to eat healthy, fresh food, and everything is very accessible. Israel is so tiny that, if you put your foot, if you stretch it, you're already in the next city. So everyday food would be a salad and fresh bread and cheese and stuff like that, and that's not difficult to either make or to buy cheaply. And when you want to make traditional fare, then, once a week you cook and you enjoy the fact that it has 27 stages. By the way, I was trying to find out which of the cuisines is the most enslaving for women. So far, I've come with the Syrian cuisine, which is immensely sophisticated, and everything takes days. So maybe the Middle East is a tough place to live in.
Yeah, and we romanticize that, don't we? People talk about how wonderful it must have been, the women making conversation around the grindstone. And maybe it was because you needed to make conversation to pass the time. So I don't feel sad that all of those arms and hands have been saved from this repetitive motion. On the other hand, there is something sad. There's a kind of... I spoke to the chef Raymond Blanc, who's a famous French chef in Britain, and he makes his pastry in a food processor with the touch of a button. And he's very against this kind of fetishization of the slow, and he'll say, well, you can make it by hand if you like, but it will take much longer and it won't be any better. So sometimes I think when we talk about this artisanal handmade stuff, it's ridiculous. But at the same time, what happens when you can do something with a machine that hands used to do? I mean, it's as if it's kind of disrespect to all of that craft and all of that ingenuity that mostly women did for so long.
I mean, it's possible. I can give you an example from a really high-end restaurant here in Bombay, one of the Taj restaurants called Konkan Cafe, which serves very traditional fish curries. And many of these fish curries require, masalas that are ideally ground by hand, because on a mortar and a pestle, because there's a sort of grainy texture that you get with a mortar and pestle that a mixer just over processes. And what the chef did, who ran this restaurant, is he got two old ladies who had spent their lives grinding, and he made them members of his chef brigade. I mean, they had salaries on par with the rest of his sous chefs. They came in saris, full saris, but they wore a coat on top. They were given absolutely the same prestige as everyone in the kitchen, and they ground these amazing masalas. So, I mean, it's possible, I guess, to find ways.
Do you know, I just think we shouldn't be too sentimental about this. I once went to a French factory that made the best, it was like Fauchon, it was a pastry factory called Le Nôtre. And I went round with the boss, and they had a fantastic reputation. And when we got to the bit where they were making apple pies, or apple flans, those perfect French pastries with apple and apricot glaze on top. And I noticed that he used a pastry break to roll the pastry, a machine to cut out the perfect rings, and then they crimped the edges by hand. So the pastry chefs were crimping the edges by hand, so you've got a little pattern around the edge. And then a depositor, big machine, gloop, put in the apple puree. And then by hand, they put the apple slices on and put the glaze on top. And I said to him, why do you use machines for some of the process and not for the whole process? And he said, I use the best I can for the process. And he said, the machine will roll the pastry perfectly thinly. It will deposit exactly the right amount of apple puree on it. But it cannot judge how to glaze the apricot jam not to fill in too much in the hollows. And we need hand crimping, otherwise it looks as if it's been made by a machine.
Yeah, and that's a testimony to
thought that's it. Let's, for goodness sake, let's make pastry by machine. It doesn't make any difference if you're making pastry, whether it's whizzed up in a...
And also the real divide is between people who cook and people who don't cook. So if people look at the cuisine of Syria, for example, and kibbeh being sort of hand-pounded, and think, well, if that's what cooking is, I can't possibly fit that into my busy day, then that's actually a disaster all round. Whereas if people think, oh, cooking can be kind of fun, and I can use these machines, and I can speed it up, and it can be done, even in the space of a working day.
I mean, I'm putting my life in my hands here if I say this, but I bet you can buy as good a chapati as you can make. Can you? Can you? Can you buy a chapati that is...
No, you can't.
No.
Absolutely.
Has to be made at home.
Absolutely
Panic in the streets of Bombay.
You can't, and well, that's the truth.
Believe me, you can buy a better chapati than I can make.
Yeah. We're going to turn it over to the audience soon for questions. But Gil, I have one particular question for you, which comes from my curiosity about Israel. A country which suddenly, after its formation, got all these food traditions of the Jewish people from across the world. And yes, there were things that that linked them in terms of the laws of kosher and things like that. But otherwise, the traditions were so dissimilar. How have these traditions fared in Israel? Are they, is the food of, say, the Cochin Jews? Like just India, you had the food of the Cochin Jews, you had the food of the Calcutta Jews, and you had the food from here, of the Beni Israeli from this coast. Are these traditions surviving in a new Israel? Are they being modified? Are they coming up into some new fancy Israeli cuisine, which maybe Yotam Ottolenghi may or may not claim to be his own. So, I mean,
So in Israel, there is a miracle happening. It's a country of 70 different ethnicities. And since Israelis are so notoriously disobedient and respect no laws, everything is kept. I mean, there is no melting pot. So there is no new Israeli cuisine, thank God. We have 70 different cuisines, and we enjoy them all. Sometimes we make crosses between them. We serve Chinese food in baguette together with shug, which is a Yemenite salsa, and we find it wonderful. Sometimes it doesn't work, but nobody tries to dictate the right way of cooking, so everything is kept, and you can walk a street in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem and find restaurants cooking in such different ways and enjoy it all. So it's a very big mess, and it's lovely.
Yeah. Great. I think we'll there's throw it open to the audience for questions. And we have about 5-10 minutes for that. Unfortunately, the lights are so strong I can't see anybody. Yeah, that gentleman over there. The mic is coming. No, I think the mic is coming.
The mic is on its way.
Actually, just...
Why don't I just give you my mic?
No, it's fine.
Hello. Yeah. Quite fascinating. Yeah, especially like, when you were describing the apple pie, my mouth was watering. I'm like, I want one of those pastries, and everything we were discussing. So I love food, and I have...
It's fine, yeah, we can hear you, go ahead.
Yeah. As I was listening to you all also, I realized, that I love fish curry, Goan fish curry. I'm a Goan. And every time I go around, trying to taste it all across, wherever I go, my wife says, you go, to even if you go to like Delhi, you'll try, if there's fish curry on the menu, you'll want to try it. So I realized that I'm not like, I'm searching for a memory, okay? Because my grandmother, when she made that fish curry, okay, I have this memory in my head, and I keep on trying to replicate it, though I enjoy every kind of fish curry, and then I'm like one expert, okay, the Delhi, this hotel fish curry is all crap or that. But I keep on searching for the memory. And as I was listening to you all, I realized that, I am not creating any memories for my children. Like, and because, quite honestly, we don't cook at home. We have a help who comes and cooks for us. And then we try and keep it healthy. Okay, we'll make the chapatis, we'll get the vegetables and all that. But there's no memory that we are, like my grandmother, to watch her cooking and help out cutting something. So, is there a solution? Because we are so busy. I don't know what, or will my children actually have memories of what my help has cooked? So it's like something which I am debating with.
Yeah, do you want to answer that?
I mean, I think that's a beautiful question, and it brings home the extent to which food memories, they're not just about the food itself, it's about the person who made it for us. And in my book, I quote, there's a British-Hungarian novelist called Charlotte Mendelssohn, and she wrote a very good article about how she was yearning for her dead grandmother's cuisine, and she looked up all these Hungarian recipes on the internet, and then she just suddenly realized, the internet is no good, I need her there in my kitchen cooking for me. I mean, I think what you're clearly juggling, like all of us are juggling who are working and have kids at the same time. And as Prue says, we don't want to idealize it too much. Nobody is probably living this perfect family table existence. But I wonder if you could just add into your repertoire one dish that you and your wife make regularly for your children. I know in our house, I do the vast majority of the cooking, partly because I'm a control freak. But on Sunday night, I go out to a yoga class, and my husband just developed this ritual. I taught him how to make pizza from scratch. And now my 7-year-old will say the most delicious thing in the world is Daddy's pizza. And that makes me feel so happy. And I'm sure there could just be one thing. Maybe you could just make breakfast for them once a week, because these memories about food and family, they are very precious.
Also, I want to correct something you said, because I think there was a bit of an assumption over there. Your child will have memories, and they may be the memories of the fish curry that your servant cooks, and that's fine. I mean, what is important is that she's getting a fish curry and not something totally manufactured. I think for many of us in India, and I think, I remember seeing this in your book because when you grew up in South Africa, too, many of our food memories are of food made by servants. And those servants were fantastic cooks. I mean, we tend to downplay the importance of servants in cooking, but so much of Indian cooking is based on these amazing food made by servants. And so I'm sure if your servant is making a great fish curry and your daughter has memories of that, that's fine. I mean,
I want to tell you about my favorite food memory. I grew up with a Zulu cook who was an absolutely wonderful cook, but it never occurred to anybody to say, go and learn to cook in the kitchen, because, privileged white girls growing up in South Africa hardly went into the kitchen. But my memory is that on my father's birthday, the cook would bring in this wonderful silver soup tureen with a lid on top. And when he took off, and there would be next to it would be a napkin and a tin opener. And the top would come off the silver soup tureen, and inside would be a big 2-pint tin of Heinz tomato soup, which my father, on his birthday, would solemnly take off the lid and pour the soup. And we'd all have Heinz tomato soup, which was the most fantastic treat. And I asked my mother years later why it always had to come in the tin. And so she said, because that would stop Charlie, who was the Zulu cook, improving it. He would be unable to resist putting a bit of cream in it or a bit of sherry in it. And it had to be straight from the tin. And I tell you what, it's just as much as sentimental, wonderful. And guess what? When I'm really tired and slightly stressed and on my own, for some reason or other, what will I do? Open a tin of Heinz tomato soup.
So my favorite food memory comes from the other way, not from the servants, from the poverty. I've been working as a restaurant critic for 30 years, and people always asking me, what is it that you look for when you come into a restaurant? And I would always say, I'm looking for truth. And it sounds a bit full of hot air, it's a weird question, but one restaurateur taught me that I was right. It was in a remote city in the north of Israel, a very simple Libyan restaurant, Jewish Libyan restaurant, a guy named Eliko, and he told me the story that he and his parents fled from Libya in the early 50s after the establishment of Israel. There was quite a bit of hostility towards Jewish communities around the Arab world, and they fled. They were very well-to-do in Libya. They had the Ford Agency in North Africa, and they left with only their clothes on, and they came to Israel to a life of poverty. They were put up in a tent, later in a tin house, and then eventually they got a one-room apartment for 8 people, 2 parents and 6 kids. They split it in half. Half of it was a grocery shop from which they lived, and in the other half they lived. And he grew up, and he was well educated, and he became a mechanic and made a lot of money, then left everything and opened a restaurant, because I felt that my vocation was to feed people. But then he told me, I was rich, I had workers, I had the best kitchen, and one day when my mom came to me, I told her, Mom, it doesn't taste right. I have the best ingredients and lots of, stuff. Why doesn't it taste as good as it used to taste in this half-room apartment? And his mom looked at him and said in Arabic, Ya ibni, my son, you didn't figure it out yet? It's because we were hungry. And this is the answer. Truth comes with love and with hunger.
We have time for one more question. Sorry, the lady over there, sorry. We're running a bit over time, so just one question.
You spoke about the introduction of various cuisines in India here, or in other countries, like in any part, cuisine from other parts of the world. What is your take on the localization of international cuisine? Like, for example, Chinese food that's available in India is nothing like the Chinese food that's actually available in China. So what is your take? Is this a good thing or a bad thing, that food that comes from other countries is adapted to local tastes?
I think the question is, we're talking about the preservation of traditions, local traditions, but what happens when international food, traditions come here and then become a sort of tradition of their own? I mean, let me ask the question, like, what do you make of British Indian food? I mean, is it a tradition or is it not?
Of course it's a tradition. I mean, ever since the British Raj, we've imported spices and made, I mean, Indian food in England used to be rather bastardized, and now we have some of the best Indian restaurants, I'm told, in the world, and they're really authentic and good. So I think that, the whole idea of curry, for example, has been deep in the tradition of Britain for the last couple of 100 years. So I think we make our own traditions. Every family makes its own traditions. My mother used to make a wonderful dessert which consisted of passion fruit, which we called granadillas, and cream, which we had on Christmas Day, and that was our tradition, and I still do it.
This is something you're actually researching at the moment. So.
Yeah, I'm researching an article on British curry houses, and I've just been introduced to the concept of Chinese Indian food or Indian Chinese food, and I find that fascinating. I mean, I think sometimes just as there's too much of a cult and a fetish of the traditional, there's definitely a cult of the authentic. And it's never really authentic, because if you're a British person in London eating this supposedly perfect regional Indian food, the context is different. It's never quite the same as it would be made in an authentic kitchen by somebody who's always made it that way. I don't think we should be too purist about food. I think actually these things kind of add to the excitement of life. I mean, the British curry house it has its own authenticity, it has its own rules. It's nothing like you would recognize from Indian food. It was purposely designed by Bangladeshi immigrants who came in, who wanted to create a cuisine designed for British palates, and it was designed on this kind of grid structure where you take a single base sauce made in a massive vat, and then if someone wants it very spicy, you call it vindaloo, and I realize real vindaloo is something else altogether, but you call it vindaloo, and you add so much chili powder that it burns someone's mouth off. If you're serving it to someone who's rather scared of chili, you call it korma, and you add a bit of extra cream. And if you're serving it for somewhere in the middle, it's called madras or rogan josh. But it's a cuisine with its own kind of charms and rituals and rules, and it served its purpose at a particular time, and it probably did open up British palates to spice in a way that maybe we hadn't seemed ready for earlier in the 20th century. And now maybe it's an institution whose time has passed, and probably the same thing will happen with Indian Chinese food.
Yeah, you can see it happening. I mean, there is Indian Chinese food, and now there are high-end Chinese food restaurants. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have Chinese bale, on this, which has suddenly become a street food. And I don't know how many people in this audience have eaten Chinese bale. How many people have eaten Chinese bale? Okay, that's not bad. It's more than I thought. Chinese bale, let me explain to you, is a concept that just appeared on the streets of this thing. What it is, it's cabbage. Because somehow we associate cabbage, stir-fried cabbage, with Chinese food. So it's like stir-fried cabbage tossed up with a little bit of really spicy sauce, and on top we put basically Bombay mix. So there's a crunchy sort of chibda on top. So there's a crunchy sort of contrast. And, it's actually quite delicious, actually quite healthy. You're eating cabbage one way or the other. See? Sorry? If they add fried noodles to it, yeah. Okay, that's not that healthy, but still. Okay, thank you so much. I mean, I'm sure we could talk a lot more about tradition, and we can actually talk a little bit more outside in the courtyard. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you so much for our participants for coming here to do our talk.